it's interesting that you call them spaces of decay, because what I had in mind was also access to one of the main sort of battles, right, during the uprising, but also in 2015, and many waves of mobilization, was to just physically be able to protest in front of the parliament.
Mm-hmm.
There's no access to the parliament physically, right? It's the space is closed. And, you know, if we're thinking about taking over those spaces of decay, like the egg and those other buildings, but also, you know, the beach or the different hotels and etc. That were also sites for mobilization. But it's interesting to also think of this parliament building as a space of decay, and what it means in that sense. I think, I don't know if you want me to reply to other points, or if we can continue.
Honestly, it's whatever's, you know, I was hoping to kind of open up a bigger discussion. Like for me, you know, maybe Melanie, we can kind of build on some of what Melanie was asking about. So for me, this question also, in addition to some of the thoughts that Jillian sort of also made me, you know, I wasn't actually thinking spatially, but now I realize how this question also can be understood spatially. And the book has that. I was also thinking about this kind of claim that you make in your chapter, Rima, about the sort of individuation sort of the fact that, you know, potentially neoliberalism also shapes, you know, how the claims become individualized and not, and maybe that allows you to speak a little bit to some of Melanie's comments as well, because it is sort of there in the chapter, right? But as I was reading it before I got to the section where you cite Lihaki, I was like, well, what about, you know, yes, Beirut Madinati, but what about also Lihaki, which is more, I would say, generally understood as not as neoliberal, I would say, and it's which I think is an important kind of intervention that you're making there. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I want to start by thanking Melanie for the very thorough comments, and I'd love to have them in writing and engage more with them and thinking about. But you definitely poked my mind on several things, and I think specifically this question that I totally agree. I need to elaborate a bit more. Now, there's always the trouble of the word limit, right? So Jeff and I played the good cop, bad cop against each other. And so he forced me to cut from my chapter and I forced him to cut from his. Both chapters started as more than 10,000 words and we had to cut down. And probably the notion of sectarian neoliberalism, I agree. And I was telling Lema yesterday that when I reread the chapter, after some distance, I realized that it's not very well fleshed out. And it's probably because I'm working on a book on that. So in my mind, the concept is clear, but probably I need to write it in a clearer way. So that's definitely something, I mean, sharpening that concept more is definitely something I want to do in this chapter. But the one thing that I found very interesting and that I definitely need to think more about and engage with in your comments, Melanie, is this idea of the two components of sectarianism that is presented as a communal project or community-based, and neoliberalism that is always tied with this idea of individualism. And I think that it's definitely something that needs to be unpacked a bit more in this chapter. And from previous work I've done, I would now very quickly say that I think that sectarianism, in as much as it looks like a communal project, it is, and the claim I'm making is that it's not sectarian and neoliberal. It's the intersectional aspect of it is that it's sectarian neoliberalism. It's both, that they co-constitute each other somehow, right? And I mean, it's a broader argument I'm making elsewhere about how the Lebanese system from the very onset has been a neoliberal system, right? The literature on neoliberalism starts with Chile in the 70s, but my claim is that it started in Lebanon, or at least some aspects of what neoliberalism is, started in Lebanon from the very onset with Michel Chiha and how he understood or how he portrayed, this Lebanese project. So in that sense, one can play a lot with this line of thinking and what it means, and more globally, right? I mean, sometimes I think maybe Lebanon is the future of the world, and this is all going to collapse in an ugly way, as it did here. But it's this idea that, it's based on differentiation, it's institutionalized in some cases, not in others, but also you're very right to say even the gendered aspect of it goes beyond just personal status law. And to me, the whole new capitalism is gendered. It relies on the care labor that women do, and all these other aspects. So probably this needs to be fleshed out more. But I want to thank you for pushing me to think about these two pillars together. And also this, I'm excited to read your piece on nationalism as well. And to me, or theoretically, sectarianism is a form of nationalism. But I'm happy to also talk more about this. Maybe not in the chapter, given the space limit, but in other work, I'm sure. I mean, this book, when we thought about it at the beginning, both Jeff and I were thinking that this is the beginning of a discussion that we want to have with the people we've invited, but also with a broader audience and beyond just Lebanon. But we both lived very intensely those moments, and we both felt that, now that things have calmed down in the street, and we found ourselves wanting to think more about what happened and to make sense of it, but also not from the lens of just Lebanon, but also acknowledging that there are these global processes, there are regional dynamics, and there's been uprisings, in many, many other places. And what do we learn from history, but also from, comparing with and connecting with scholars and activists and militants and journalists elsewhere. And we also did not want it to be just scholars, and this is why the book is constructed the way it is. The question about the importance of neoliberalism, the critique, I wouldn't say, a critique, but I think from a very generous place. Many of those activists, whether Beirut Madinati or Lihaqi or others, are my friends and my comrades and people I really respect and cherish. But I think it's an attempt at, and these are things I've discussed with many of them, but I think, neoliberalism plays a central role, and what links what is happening to Lebanon with what is happening in other places in the world is one of them is definitely neoliberalism. Now, in the context of Lebanon, it was very clear that this is probably the only uprising in the region that clearly kicked off for socioeconomic reasons. Very clearly from the onset. People were talking about the governor of the central bank and politicians as one. So that moment at the beginning made it very clear that politics and economics are not separated. At least in this liminal moment of the beginning, it was clear to everyone that they're one, this is one class or one group or one, category in society that we're fighting against. But also what these processes of neoliberalization mean in terms of how you shape activism. And I think in my chapter, I was trying to talk a bit, what I had at the back of my mind, I can't remember if I mentioned him in the book or not, in the chapter or not, but it's Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism. And this idea that we live in a world where we're unable to even imagine anything beyond capitalism. So even our most radical political imaginaries are so shaped by capitalism itself. And these are the contradictions that I was trying to, it was good. Of course, the intentions of people were to change, but what kind of change and what direction and what is it that we can imagine beyond this reality seem to be always constrained by the very reality itself, right? So it creates those contradictions whereby, individualism becomes very predominant, and the examples I give from Lebanon or Iraq, but also so I think what I was doing in this chapter is an invitation to like unleash our political imagination and try to imagine something different. That even so, our references or our framing are very much tied to a modern world that does not seem to always match the realities we're living, right? Such as this whole legal aspect. That I'm not saying it's not important. Of course, I mean, legal activism is important, but it ties us to limits that I think, for a revolutionary break to happen, we need to even break those limits and be able to imagine something beyond just going to court, right? Like a different type of change. Yeah, and the question of Killian that I think is linked, but is also interesting, is about, you know, the comparative aspect of what does Lebanon offer in the sense that, so Lebanon and Iraq are the two cases in the region that did not have an autocracy, which makes it more complicated to think of what the success is, right? You know, it's not just toppling one person. But I think what we can, or, you know, what is important in those cases is that it actually gets us to stage 2, right? So what we see in Tunisia, what we see is that the first stage was to topple a person, and then the actual struggle really begins on, you know, and this is where you see that the shape that protest takes or revolutionary moments take under neoliberalism is that you have an outpour of millions in the streets, but you don't have the strong organizations or a clear political alternative or political project. And this is where success becomes more difficult, because, you know, they all don't want this, but they all want different things. And so it becomes a struggle of a different form. In Lebanon, I think, you know, we kind of jumped a bit, I mean, we don't have one, we have 6 men, and we can add to them, you know, the governor of the central bank, so there's 7 men. But beyond those 7 men, it's also about, you know, changing the whole thing. And this is where we see today the divisions between those who want to run for elections and want to reform from within, or those who are saying, you know, it's the Taif is done, we need a complete shift, or those who are saying, you know, the problem is the way with the economic structure. And so I think it's you know, we're open to all of these debates, and I think we're in this very long and difficult revolutionary process that might end up in reproducing more tyranny or not, but that has definitely started, in my understanding. So I'll let Jeff maybe add more.